So perhaps it's a good time to get started. Thank you so much. It's good to meet you finally. I feel like we've been connected in many ways, both in terms of lots of mutual acquaintances and collaborators and colleagues, but also kind of common research interests. And it's great to finally be able to connect and to hear you talk about your recent work. So thank you for agreeing to speak in our seminar series.
Excellent.
And let me just make a very quick introduction to everybody. Adam Waytz is a professor at the Kellogg School of Management at the Northwestern University, which seems to have an increasing number of colleagues and friends of ours as well are in there, like Dashun Wang and Heijin Jung, and many others, some of the old-timers as well. And it looks like a very interesting business school in terms of the overlap with our own interests and the science of teams and the science of humans and machines and the science of success and all of that, and the impact of AI on labor. Now, Adam, I think congratulations, you got recently promoted to a chair professor, so congrats for that. Working in the area of ethics, of technology, but also management and organization more broadly. And I should say that, so Adam's work has mostly, I guess your early work has been mostly on anthropomorphization, so how people perceive minds in other people or things or animals. And I think and how this affects moral cognition and perception and behavior as well. And I think that's a really fascinating topic, and obviously getting more and more fascinating by the day. And one particularly kind of interesting thing, I was looking at your recent research publications, and I saw this paper. The title is, "Does Online Technology Make Us More or Less Sociable?" I would argue that post-COVID definitely makes us more sociable than the counterfactual. I wonder if you've revised the answer on that question. So anyway, without further ado, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say today, and I'll leave the floor to you. Thanks, Adam.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for joining me. This is really unlike any other talk I've given. Usually, you get invited to a seminar series. In this case, I've been just following Iyad's work for some years, have become a fan of it. I'm a fan of Berlin. I'm a fan of Max Planck. And I just never met him before, but emailed him out of the blue to say, hey, what's happening at this Center for Humans and Machines? Just seemed fascinating what's going on. And he said, well, why don't you give a talk and we can talk further. So this is basically just an introduction to who I am and the type of work that I do, and happy for you to interrupt at any point. These are just going to be kind of snapshots of the types of work I do, but I always want to start by noting this kind of strange moment we're in, where I don't think people are very certain about how to think about the rise of technology in our daily lives. If you go on Twitter, which is a terrible website, but I'm on it all the time anyway, and you go to the trending topics tab, they'll sort of list the news of the day or what are people talking about. In a few months, one thing that caught the attention of people was this proclamation by Elon Musk of SpaceX and Tesla, where at a conference he said, artificial intelligence is humanity's greatest threat. And then just a few hours later on the trending topics tab was this story, okay? Security robot drowns itself. And hopefully you can see these. I think this perfectly encapsulates kind of the ambivalence around technology. There's excitement, there's anxiety. Is technology a threat, or is it something that really needs humans to get it where it needs to go? And this kind of general psychology of automation, what I'm kind of calling what I do, is something I've been studying since graduate school, where my first publication with Nick Epley and John Cassiopo, we laid out a theory of why people humanize things, including why people humanize non-human technology. And then more recently, a lot of this work culminated in a book that I published in 2019 called The Power of Human. And along the way, I would say my work really speaks to several questions under this rubric. One, which Ayad referred to, what is the effect of kind of what I call everyday automation, kind of the automation in our pockets, these phones, automated systems that we carry around with us? What's the effect on our psychology of having all of this stuff at our disposal? I've also zeroed in on specific forms of technology, including the autonomous car, which I know many of you are familiar with. A lot of my work also just concerns kind of basic preferences. When do people prefer technology doing a job versus humans doing a job? And then what I'm most interested in these days are kind of the broad scale societal effects of automation beyond the individual psychology, how automation is changing kind of group behavior. And my pitch for doing this work, I mean, I usually have to give this pitch to people who are really not familiar with this work, not folks like you guys, is there's endless headlines about what are the effects of automation on our jobs and on our future, and how robots are going to take our jobs or change our jobs. And I tend to find that the voices of behavioral scientists and psychologists are often missing from these conversations. There's a lot of people who are plugged into the technology itself in these conversations, and there's a lot of economists talking about the labor implications and the wage implications. Interestingly, I think there's a whole untapped set of psychological consequences that don't get discussed as much. I know you are all already sympathetic to this issue, but this is something I normally talk about for people less familiar with this research. And so my pitch for there being more of a seat at the table for behavioral scientists is, I think behavioral scientists and psychologists and organizational behavior folks are useful in four ways. One, we often deal in interactions, meaning, instead of saying whether technology is good or bad, psychologists often deal in stating the conditions under which when technology is good or bad. As social psychologists, of which I am one, our field is rooted in studying attitudes and preferences. And so beyond whether this technology improves our lives, we're very well suited to answer the question, do people like this stuff? And if not, why not? Third, given that much of social psychology involves studying interaction between human beings, I think we're suited to answer, how do we optimize human-machine interaction? How do we optimize division of labor between humans and machines? And then finally, as I mentioned, what I'm really interested in today, and what I'll try to give you more than just a snapshot on, is I think social psychologists and behavioral psychologists think about consequences aside from the consequences for innovation and technology and labor and wages and economic development alone. And I'll give you a little bit of work on each of these points. I'll try to tell you about a little bit more work on the fourth point if we have time. So any questions so far? I haven't presented any data yet. And Ayad, are you able to see these 4 bullet points here? These just want to make sure my PowerPoint is rolling. Okay, let's get started. So this question of is technology good or bad? I find that when we read things in the Financial Times or the New York Times, or see it on the BBC or CNN or whatever, there's a lot of discussion about technology, and it tends to be oversimplified in terms of technology is helping us or technology is hurting us, okay? And a lot of the questions over the past several years have to do with a topic very close to my own interest, which is what is the effect of online technology on empathy? And you can see there's debates on both sides. And so what Kurt Gray and I decided to do is actually scour the empirical research for real studies that have looked at this question. And we wanted to answer, okay, does using online technology boost empathy or reduce empathy? And the answer, once we looked at all the research that we came to, was yes. Okay, both are true. And by the way, it's too early to say, because despite all of the discussion around this question, there's surprisingly little empirical research that actually teases this question. Just give you a sense of what we actually did in our analysis of the work out there that we published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, and I'll explain this figure in a moment. We went through Google Scholar and looked at any paper that fit our definition of measuring both online technology use and empathy. And then we found that the papers on empathy were so few, we actually had to expand our construct to call this sociability. Sociability meant we were including not just papers on empathy, but also perspective taking, emotion recognition, and emotional intelligence. So now we're expanding our search for any paper that measures online technology use and any one of these four constructs. So the ability to be a good social being. What do we mean by online technology use? Well, again, there are surprisingly few papers. We're including internet use, use of mobile apps, including texting, and we had to expand our definition to include virtual reality as well as sort of a transportative technology. Is it technically online technology? You could argue yes or no, but in order to give ourselves a shot at finding something, we included papers on virtual reality as well. So we came across 70 papers that measured both the extent of use of one of these technologies, performance on a task or dependent variable that fell under one of these four buckets. And we basically found that there are three different relationships between tech use and sociability. One, there's work suggesting that when you are using tech to expand on a relationship where you already have some kind of deep in real life interaction, tech can actually enhance empathy, okay, enhance sociability. On the other hand, and this is of no surprise to you, when you're using technology as a replacement for in real life interaction, this tends to degrade sociability. And then there's a third pathway, which I think is perhaps the most interesting. Perhaps these two are obvious. The third one is that for people who are elderly or who struggle with in real life interaction, we call this the better than nothing pathway, which is that when you struggle to interact with people in real life, sometimes these are people with various mental conditions or people who just have a hard time getting out of their house, a little bit of online interaction boosts sociability compared to nothing at all. And so this is kind of one takeaway from our big study of all this. But the other main takeaway was actually that there's surprisingly little research to be done. And so we laid out a path going forward of what we would like to see: more random assignment, less correlational studies, more causality. But here's the snapshot of what we know so far. Questions? All right. Second issue that I've been very interested in is, do people like any of this stuff? Certainly, we know a lot of technology has the capacity to improve our lives, make it more efficient. Even the autonomous car is likely to reduce car accidents in general and make driving generally safer. But how do you get people to like this stuff in the first place? And so with a grant from General Motors, we were actually able to study people's trust responses to driving in an autonomous car. We didn't actually get access to an autonomous car, but we got this very realistic simulator that we set up in downtown Chicago in our lab. It was very realistic to the point that the first time I drove it, I was looking over my shoulder to change lanes. And so I'll tell you about our one big experiment on this, where people came into our lab They were randomly assigned to one of three conditions. It's a very simple study. In the normal condition, they actually drove like you would normally drive a car. They drove it on a course where you do lane changing and acceleration and turning and all that. And then there were two conditions that were autonomous or self-driving. In one condition, what we call our agentic condition, the autonomous car just took control. It did lane following, steering, and speed control. And you feel like you're driving in the car. You can feel the rumble of the road and you experience things as you're passing other cars, but you're not actually driving. And then in an anthropomorphic condition, the car was again autonomous, and we simply added a voice to kind of narrate the drive, a name of the car. We called the car Iris, and we made the car female. Okay, so now there are these little cues to humanness. And we had them drive one basic course, and they reported, just self-report, what we call self-reported trust. How confident are you in the car? Are you willing to give control to the car? Do you trust that the car can get you where you need to go? And this is a highly reliable composite. And then we also measured what we're calling behavioral trust in two ways. What we did is we had everyone drive down the road and in all conditions get into an accident. And importantly, the accident wasn't their fault. We measured how much their heart rate changed in response to getting into the accident and how startled they looked. Okay, so we had them hooked up to skin conductance to measure heart rate response. And basically, we're reverse scoring heart rate increase and startle as a measure of how comfortable are you in the face of an accident that wasn't your fault. I'll show you what this accident looks like in a moment. And by the way, heart rate change and startle were highly correlated. So that's a composite measure as well. And then we asked them how much blame they would assign to the car and the engineer and the people responsible for the car after the accident occurred as well. So here is what the accident actually looks like in the anthropomorphic condition. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear the audio, but what you will see here, and it's very important for me explaining the results, is that this is a case where you are blindsided. So you're driving along.
I'm sorry, we've had an accident. Please pull over and put the car in park.
All right, so I don't know how well that translated over WebEx, but you kind of get the idea. The car narrates your experience. And so we measured heart rate change from the beginning of the course to the point of the collision before the narration comes on. And that was one measure of behavioral trust. And then we found out that that was correlated with our measure of startled. How startled someone was measured through video recording their response, and then we measured them, or we scored them on a 1 to 3 scale, or I should say research assistants scored them based on how startled they look. So I'll give you an example. A 1, not at all startled, a 2, moderately startled, and a 3, extremely startled. So here's someone who was scored a 1. All right. Pretty much no response at all. That would be scored a 1. A little bit of a jolt. That would be scored a 2. And then extremely startled. That would be scored a 3. And the basic results that we found, again, we're calling this behavioral trust, but you could call it whatever. You could call it comfort. We're reverse scoring the composite of how much did heart rate increase and how startled did people look. These are highly correlated. And here's what we found. The y-axis is going to be standardized. So negative and positive doesn't really mean negative or positive. These are z-scores, basically. And so, first of all, what we found on self-reported trust was a totally linear effect, which is when you're driving the car on its own, quite obviously, you don't trust giving control to the car. We wouldn't give control to our regular cars if they're not autonomous. But in the agentic condition, you're reporting more trust in the car, and significantly more when the car has these slightly human-like cues, a voice, a name, a gender. Then on behavioral trust, it was really only in the condition where the car had these human-like cues where people felt somewhat comfortable. This is the reverse score of heart rate increase and startle. So people were the least startled when they had this car sort of narrating its experience. And then in terms of blame for the accident, what you see is certainly you're going to blame an autonomous car more than a regular car for getting into this accident. That's what you see in this condition. But what I think is interesting and not necessarily anticipated is that blame significantly decreases when the car is anthropomorphic. And we liken it to what happens when you're driving with a cab driver. If they get into an accident like the one that you saw, you would give them somewhat of the blame. But if you believe the car is human-like and thoughtful, which we also measured, then you're willing to give it a little bit more benefit of the doubt, and you're less likely to blame it. So most of this was just an exploratory experiment, but it shows how these little human-like cues really enhance trust and diminish blame. Questions at this point?
Hello, this is Jason, sorry.
Yes.
I was wondering if this was only done for the female gender, right? Just a clarification here.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. And every time
my guess is this would change if depending on the surrounding culture, if there was a different gender. That's the reason I'm asking.
Yeah. Not only was it female, but it was a very calming female voice. This is actually an organizational behavior colleague of ours who could have a second life as like a narrator. She has a very calming voice. It's a female voice. Maybe it provided some comfort that a male voice would not. It was very similar to GPS. And nowadays with GPS, you can choose your voice. A lot of people like to have a British accent. You can choose to have Snoop Dogg narrate your drive. If we had more time with the simulator, we're kicking ourselves now for not randomizing that as well. So this might be something about her voice. But nonetheless, it did have a pretty compelling effect.
Thank you.
Sure.
So just another question. The control was a condition where the person was driving, like they had a control of the. But did you have you didn't have a condition where they were driven by another person?
No, and again, that would be such a great comparison. We would expect, I would expect similar results on blame, because we think of this as having basically a cab driver, a taxi driver who certainly I've actually experienced this accident that you saw in a taxi cab, and I was on the way to the airport, and I thought this guy was kind of zoning out anyway, and so indeed I did blame him somewhat for the accident, even though it wasn't his fault. Had he been more thoughtful, I would have been down here. Now, what's interesting is you could imagine a scenario where trust is actually enhanced for the anthropomorphic self-driving car compared to a human cab driver, and that would have been a nice comparison to have, I think. Because also when you look at, you've done a lot of this work, if you look at kind of public perception, public surveys on people's willingness to use autonomous cars, one of the most interesting findings I've seen in sort of representative polls is that, at least in the US, people are not inclined to have an autonomous car as their primary car. But if you ask them, are you willing to use autonomous cars instead of like Uber ride sharing, they're much more willing. So I think they're sort of equating the autonomous car to an Uber driver. Now, I'll go a bit quicker through the next few studies. They're, again, just kind of some snapshots of things that I've done so I can get to the more recent work. Another topic that I've been studying on this issue of do people like this stuff is the idea of aversion to playing God. And aversion to playing God, is probably popularized in the Frankenstein story. I'm interested in this idea, which I'll define in a moment, to explain why do people have an aversion toward technology, even when that technology might be useful for us. Stem cell technology, genetic technology, even cloning technology, where we could clone fruits and vegetables and solve a food shortage. And essentially what I've found in work with Leanne Young is that there's this heuristic that people follow, which was kind of popularized in behavioral sciences by Cass Sunstein, where people simply don't like the idea of playing God. And this isn't necessarily religious people. We show this applies toward religious and non-religious people, but it's this idea that humans shouldn't assume some power which is beyond our control. Now, for some people, they believe, okay, that's God's domain. Other people believe that's the domain of nature itself. Nature itself should be kind of controlling genetics and things like that. And other people believe in fate. But basically, we found evidence of this pervasive heuristic where people don't like technology insofar as they believe that there is some superordinate agent responsible. And so one of the things we do, we did a bunch of studies on this, is we simply measure how much do people express this aversion to playing God, responding to items such as, it bothers me when humans try to take on the role of God. And again, this isn't necessarily religious people who are saying this, it's people who believe that there's some higher order of things. And then we show that the extent to which they endorse aversion to playing God predicts reduced donations to causes that support genetic engineering technology, reduced willingness to fund the National Science Foundation, which is a government organization in the US that funds science and technology. And we did one experiment across the board. We showed that people tend to express moral disapproval of things like reproductive technologies, genetic testing, IVF, to actually help people get pregnant, even producing radioactive material. And so what we did was, in general, people will say these things are not so morally acceptable. But what we did is an experiment where we had one control condition where we had them write about a neutral topic. In two other conditions, we had them write about a time they either played God or saw someone play God. And what did people write about? Things like having to kill a pet or give birth. So things surrounding life and death. And when you familiarize people with this idea that, playing God is something everyone does in everyday life, they rated this composite of various technologies as more morally acceptable than the control condition. So again, this is just kind of toying with this idea. Why do people like or dislike technology? Can we alter those beliefs a little bit? Then the other topic that I've been studying now for, I would say, 7 or 8 years is how do people, assuming that robots are taking some jobs or taking some of our work, what are people's preferences for dividing labor between humans and machines? And why are people uncomfortable with automation in certain jobs? Work with Mike Norton, we developed a hypothesis where we simply said, based on the research that's out there in terms of how people stereotype technology and think about robots, they think about robots as being very good at analytical thinking and cognition and higher order thought, but they don't think of robots or machines or algorithms as having the capacity to feel or express emotions. And we could debate whether that's accurate or not, but we know about people's lay theories about machines. And we said, given these lay theories, we believe that people will be more comfortable with, at the time we were using the term bot sourcing, outsourcing jobs to robots, insofar as these jobs involve cognition or thinking, but they would be less comfortable giving jobs to robots when the jobs involve feeling and emotion. And we're relying on prior work by Kurt Gray, Dan Wegner, Steve Lofton, Nick Haslam, and then work in my own lab, where we show that people tend to think about robots as low in emotional capacity, high in cognitive thought capacity. And these are very simple studies. We did these studies on MTurk, which is not necessarily an ideal place to run a lot of behavioral science research, but it was perfect for our purposes because what we told people was something that was true, which is that on MTurk, this massive Amazon Mechanical Turk marketplace, there's a lot of jobs, little jobs that humans perform, including our studies, but they also rate images, they do proofreading, they solve problems, and a lot of these jobs are being replaced by bots that can do these jobs just as well or better than humans. And so in our study A, which is a within subject study, we told people about the situation. Robots are replacing some of you guys, you workers on MTurk. And what we told them is that some of these tasks, which are called HITs on MTurk, human intelligent tasks, involve thinking and analytical reasoning. Some of these tasks involve feeling, emotion, and emotional evaluation. And then we had them evaluate how comfortable are you with robots taking the cognition jobs? How comfortable are you with robots taking the emotional jobs? I'll show you what those items look like on the next page. Study B was a replication and extension. This is just a between subject study where we said, okay, as you know, bots are taking some of the cognition-based tasks on here, or people in another condition were told bots tasks are being outsourced to bots in the emotional realm, tasks that require emotion evaluation, etc. And what we ask people in these studies are how do you feel about this? Does this concern you? Does it disturb you? Does it pose a threat to you? Is it unwise? Or is it a good idea? Is it effective? The y-axis here is comfort with outsourcing these tasks to robots. And what we found in study A, our within subject study, is people indeed express more comfort for robots taking the cognitive tasks versus the emotional tasks. Same in study B. And then based on these findings, we found that we could mitigate this discomfort if we reframe a job as requiring cognition. So people don't like a robotic surgeon because they think, surgery involves some sort of emotional capacity, but when we frame the job as really requiring cognition and thought, then they're more comfortable with a robotic surgeon. Or if you design a robot to appear more capable of emotion, then they get on board with saying, okay, maybe the robot could handle some emotional tasks. And if we have time at the end, I'll talk about some work I'm expanding on here where we're looking at why people like robotic whistleblowers. Any questions at this point?
So I'm just curious about this because we wrote a piece recently, like with Jean-Francois, on the system 1, system 2 kind of analogy. It seems to be related. So what do you think is the mechanism behind this? Like, are people ascribing certain mental states to the robot and maybe expecting different kinds of mistakes? I'm just curious if you've thought a little bit more about what's behind that. That you saw.
So in this particular paper, it was as simple as stereotyping. So we know from the Gray and Wegner, people see robots high on agency, low on emotion. Similar with the Nick Haslam work. I think system 1, system 2 would fit in there perfectly. Similar thing where, people use different terms. Kurt and colleagues use experience. We use emotion here. You're saying system 1. all of these things are different, but they kind of factor analyze similarly. This is a very, to tell you how just brute force this paper was and how much it just relied on stereotyping. In other papers in the paper, in other studies in the paper, we relied on some other literature that suggests people think of different ethnicities as more or less robotic. So in fact, it turns out that people think of the British as more robotic than the Irish, okay? And so then we would choose jobs that we thought were good for robots, and we would say, who do you think jobs should be outsourced to, the British or the Irish? I think, we did this for Spanish citizens and German citizens as well. Again, these are stereotypes. These are not my endorsements. People stereotype Germans as more robotic, maybe, proximity to Stuttgart and cars, and that's what's going on in their mind. People think of Spanish people as less robotic, more feeling, more emotional. Again, this is totally based on stereotypes, I'm not making any accurate claims here. And people treat Germans as more robotic as a result. So the mechanism here is very blunt. Now, in this work that I've been doing more recently on why do people prefer a robotic whistleblower, that is an algorithm that identifies, there's been some ethical wrongdoing in the company. This mortgage application, there's been some false information entered. Who do you prefer identifies that and tells the higher ups? An algorithm, which, there are algorithms to do this, or a human being? People prefer the algorithm because there's the perception of objectivity for a robot. So that's one step beyond a mechanism in this case, but we're only getting started here. Any other questions?
Hey, Adam, Leonardo here.
Sure.
I don't know if you're probably going to talk about that, but of course, everybody knows that there are less discussions on this Twitter censoring Trump, and that whistleblowers that could be implemented in these kind of situations. Maybe we could save some time in the end to discuss a little bit that, or maybe you could quickly just say something about that. Would people accept these kind of things? Do you have any ideas? Thank you.
So I'll say a little bit now, so I don't forget at the end. Basically, I was doing all this research on human-machine interaction, all this stuff. And then I was doing parallel research with Leanne Young and James Dungan on whistleblowing. And what we found is that why do people blow the whistle? It's out of some, and by whistleblowing, I simply mean reporting wrongdoing in an organization to someone in power. Why do people report bad behavior? It's out of some moral imperative, but also most whistleblowers are not treated very well. Whether it's like a Deutsche Bank whistleblower, a Volkswagen whistleblower for the emissions scandal, General Motors in the U.S. had many scandals. All the big banks have had these scandals around 2008, selling fraudulent securities, blah, blah, blah. People don't like the person who blows the whistle because they're seen as disloyal and self-interested and having an ulterior motive. It occurred to me that these are all things that people perceive robots not to have. People don't perceive robots to have emotional attachment to an organization whereby they could be loyal or disloyal. They don't perceive robots to have self-interest. Given that so much work is being done in organizations by, I use the term robot loosely, systems, machines, etc. What if the machine directly reported wrongdoing instead of it having to go through some human intermediary who people all of a sudden put a lot of distrust on? And the example I was thinking of was General Motors. They knew that one of their ignition switches in one of their cars was faulty, such that it could stall up while you're driving on the highway. Now, a safety inspector, multiple safety inspectors identified this issue. They tried to report it, and one guy in particular was very much punished. Okay, he said, this isn't your role. Don't talk about this. And 132 people died, and then General Motors had to pay millions of dollars. And I was thinking, well, how do you even determine that there's a problem with the ignition switch to begin with? You use technology to test it. And so if the technology could bypass the human being, maybe you would have people taking that issue more seriously. And then there's no human to blame and say this is an ulterior motive. So I'm still, where I struggle is I'm a psychologist. I am not a tech expert. It took me 10 minutes to figure out WebEx today. Okay. So I'm always trying to partner with people who can actually think about the design and how would this actually work in practice. But given that some of these systems are in place, I don't think it's science fiction to say, okay, you could even implement these types of systems in government as well. So thank you for that. In the interest of time, I'm just gonna go through quickly my final project I wanted to present, which is the one I'm most excited about, and this is with my postdoc, Monica Gomez-Jokic, where we said, okay, the rise of automation clearly has a lot of economic implications, but does it have implications for how we treat other humans, and in particular, immigrants? Because we know, based on some work by Freiberger and Shen, that if you look at the United States, at least, areas that lost more jobs as a result of automation also shifted to become higher Trump voting areas, okay? And Trump here, Donald Trump, is just a proxy for the candidate at the time who was more restrictive on immigration than Hillary Clinton. So what does this mean? This is like cross-sectional data. This is correlation. There's a lot of factors they try to control for, but isn't this interesting? That areas that lost more jobs to robots, well, they also tended to vote more for the anti-immigration candidate. This is one study, but you also see this exact same pattern in Sweden. Work by Dalbo shows that areas in Sweden that were most affected by automation shifted more toward voting for the radical right party, which is, again, the least welcoming of immigrants. And then there are two other papers that show the same pattern emerges across Western Europe. So, none of these projects are studying anything about immigration. They're just showing that areas that lost jobs to automation tend to vote for far-right candidates and political parties who are more restrictive on immigration. So let's look at this more directly. We scoured all the nationally representative surveys that we could find for any surveys that included questions both on how do you feel about automation? That is, do you think robots are good for the country or bad for the country? Do you worry about losing a job to a robot? Does the rise of technology, do you think this is good for the economy, bad for the economy? And the survey also had to contain a question about immigration. Are immigrants good for the economy? Are you worried about immigration? Do you think immigration should be more restrictive? And we found 6 nationally representative surveys in the US going back from 1986 to 2016, and then a big Eurobarometer survey that measures attitudes of people throughout Europe. And the first question was just looking at these items, our automation questions and our immigration questions, is there a relationship? And if you look at just the standardized betas, yes. In every survey we looked at, there was a relationship such that the more concerned people are about automation, the more anti-immigration they are. When we control for any demographic variable you can think of, political ideology, race, age, employment status, whatever, all of our effects hold, except for 2, which are reduced to non-significance. So, there are other factors at work here as well. And then we also controlled for some of these surveys, 6 out of the 7, had other questions about employment threats unrelated to automation. So if this is just about, we're worried about employment because of automation, then that wouldn't be very interesting. But these surveys, 6 out of 7, had questions about, are you worried about inflation as a threat to employment, the shift from manufacturing to service jobs, decline in work ethic, offshoring, things like that, and controlling for other employment-related threats. In 5 out of the 6, the effect holds. So this is at least, it's a bunch of nationally representative data where at least we have some evidence that there is an effect between people's concerns about automation and their anti-immigrant sentiment, which largely can't be accounted for by other things. Not perfect, but it gives us a sense we're on the right path. And by the way, the effect could have gone in the opposite direction. You could think, well, when people realize that the big threat to employment is automation, they're more sympathetic toward immigrants. And Kurt Gray has done some work suggesting that is a possible pathway as well. We found the opposite here. Or you could imagine no effect. Why should my thoughts about robots be connected to my thoughts about immigrants? Anyway, we sought to test this pattern further in a more targeted way. We ran 3 studies that were almost identical in nature, one with working adults in Chicago, one with a British sample online, one with an American sample online. And all of the surveys took the same form. 1, how concerned are you about automation in general? Are you threatened by the prospect of automation? And in study 2C, we broke this down into personal concerns, like are you personally concerned with losing your job? And general concerns. Are you concerned about the impact of automation in the workplace on society? But the other 2 studies, we just kind of combined all these factors into a general, how concerned are you about automation? Then we measured perceived intergroup threat toward immigrants, and we measured 2 types of threats. What has been referred to as realistic threat, which is, do you think immigrants are an economic threat? Are they a tax burden? Do they take more than they contribute? And symbolic or cultural threat. That is, do you think immigration is undermining American culture? Okay, so these are 2 things that could be affected by concerns about automation. And then we asked questions explicitly about immigration policy. Should we be more restrictive in our immigration policy? And we asked other politics questions to show that these effects were specific to immigration, not just general right-leaning or conservative-leaning political stances. And I'll just flash through the data because it's the same for all 3 studies. Basically, automation concerns enhance both realistic threat and symbolic threat. So it's not just, well, I'm concerned about robots taking jobs. Immigrants are also a threat to the economy, and therefore I'm restrictive. It's also, automation is an alteration to our way of life, okay? It's really going to change the culture, and that activates the threat of a cultural shift through immigration as well, which makes people more restrictive in their desired immigration policy. We see the exact same effects in our British sample. Here, the realistic threat actually is pretty much wiped out in our mediation model. And it's really more about this cultural change. And then to give you just a big mess of a slide, when we break this down by, okay, is this driven by I'm worried about my job in particular being automated, personal automation concerns versus societal automation concerns, people are more concerned with the general effects of automation on society, okay? It's not that people necessarily think a robot is going to take their job and therefore they're worried about immigrants. It's that they're worried about some general effect on society. So, of course, we want to establish some causality. And so what we did is we conducted an experiment where we either expose people to a control condition where we just give them information about employment decline in general. I'll show you what that looks like. Or two conditions where we have people go to a website where it actually tells them, based on the job you entered at the beginning of the study, how likely is your job going to be automated, okay? And I'll show you what this looks like. We can break it down a little further. We tell some people, your job has a high likelihood of being automated, or your job has a low likelihood of being automated. So everyone enters their demographics, their jobs. What do you currently do? You're randomly assigned to a control condition where you read about employment declines, or one of two automation salience conditions where you're told, you know, automation is coming. Based on your job, you have a high likelihood or a low likelihood of being automated. Then they answer questions about threat and support for restrictive immigration policies. So in our control condition, they just read about employment declines. In our automation condition, they're told that 47% of US employment is at risk of being automated. And then you're told, based on the information you've given us, you have a low or a high probability of being personally automated. And again, if this was about personal concerns, we would expect this condition, our high automation condition, to show the biggest effect. But instead, both automation conditions pretty much show the same result. So compared to the control condition, if you're just told in general, automation is a threat to employment, you express more support for restrictive immigration policies. You perceive immigrants as a higher realistic economic threat and a symbolic threat to your culture. Both of these forms of threat mediate the effect. And so, again, the picture we're seeing is not just automation is coming for our jobs. My job in particular, I'm worried about that. I displace my concern on immigrants. That's part of the story, but I really think it's more this general concern that automation represents a change to our daily way of life. People perceive immigrants as a similar source of change. I certainly don't endorse that view, but that seems to be what's driving the effect. And then in a final study, we said, okay, if this isn't about people's personal concerns, let's take it outside of the personal realm altogether. We're going to tell people about a company that needs to cut costs. And this is a pretty basic main effect study. We said, this is a company that's either cutting costs because they're adopting new technology, they're automating jobs, or they're restructuring and downsizing. And then we gave them pairs of worker demographics, and we said, okay, which percentage of these different worker types do you think the company should lay off? Female workers versus male workers, older workers versus younger workers, less educated versus highly educated workers, immigrant versus non-immigrant workers. And the only category where we saw movement across conditions was immigrant workers, where in the automation condition, people suggested that they think the company should lay off more immigrant workers than in the restructuring condition. So, in general, what have we found? A relationship. Is the relationship bidirectional? Does concern about immigration increase concern about robots? Unclear. Perhaps we have some correlational data that can't fully establish causality, but we do have causality in two of our studies. We think this is broader, in a broad sense, due to kind of the idea that technology represents a change to our worldview and values. And so any other change feels threatening as well. We have evidence for this over a 30-year period going back to 1986. And this is not simply accountable by other factors. That is our work on automation and immigration, kind of future directions where I'm going right now. I think there's some work going on in your world as well about the idea of automation and creativity. We show that exposing people to the idea of automation as a threat to their employment makes people more likely to want to enroll in classes to increase creativity, put creativity front and center on their CV, emphasize their own creativity. Creativity is believed that to be something that robots are not good at and humans are. That might not be true, but that's what our subjects believe. I'm doing this work on the robotic whistleblower that I mentioned, work on how just the awareness of bots on Twitter, not even exposure to bots, but the awareness of bots can lead to ideological conflict. And then some more recent work on robotic journalism, the journalism that you're seeing where certain websites will actually just have algorithms write about financial news or sports news, and people seem to see that news as less biased. So we're perfectly out of time. So I want to thank my collaborators on all of this. Sorry, I'm going up to the minute, but I also want to thank all of you, and maybe when this is all over, I'll meet you guys someday. So I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes, but feel free to sign off.
Thank you so much. No, we often go a little bit over anyway, so that's perfectly fine. And we did have lots of questions during the talk. So
Sure.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating work. I'll just wait to see if anybody has a question they want to jump in right away.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you
Go
for your
ahead.
talk. Yeah, I actually have two questions. So the first one is about so the big two dimensions. You mentioned that people perceive robots have as lacking the capacity of emotion, and then we should design robots to appear more capable of emotion. So I was wondering, would you think like things can go in a different direction, like people believe robots as inherently incapable of delivering emotions? So when robots express that, I'm totally sympathetic about your experience, and people would feel like extremely negative about such expressions because they think robots are faking it, and this is not authentic.
Yeah. So this is a real question for people in charge of design. Now, Kurt Gray, who I've mentioned quite a bit, one of my colleagues and co-authors on things, he's done work showing that if you design a robot to look too capable of emotion, people express discomfort. Okay, it violates their expectations. On the other hand, and it's funny to talk about robots because most robots we're aware of don't look like this. They don't look like humans at all. They're sort of invisible. When we're talking about automation, we're talking about systems that we don't even see. But like a very extreme version of this would be this type of robot. So Powers and Kiesler have shown that facial design of robots, if you're really using a humanoid, this type of facial design where you make the face sort of wider and more like a child, really, people are more comfortable with this type of robot performing emotion-oriented jobs. But I think you're totally right that if you designed it the wrong way, it could really backfire. I think that's also where voice goes a long way. People experience voice as having the capacity for emotion. So you might not need a face at all. That voice seems to give people the impression, okay, oh, this is something with some emotional intelligence. And that's where some actually robotic therapy has made some advances as well.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. So the second question is about culture. So how would you think like in different cultures would people's perception of, let's say, robots or machines also converge into these two dimensions? And would that also differ in the extent that people like project agency and experience in the robots, right? They have different cultural norms in terms of these agents.
Yeah. It should. My sense is that set of kind of bidimensional representation was fairly universal, but I can't say for sure. And so places that have made more advances in robotics might be much more comfortable with assigning emotion to robots. Like right now, I'm familiar, Sony sent me this robot that's actually a dog. Aibo. It's a robotic dog. And there's also, you might be familiar with this robotic seal from Japan, Paro. These are these companionship robots. They're very easy to ascribe emotion to. They also look like animals, which helps. And so if there's a general culture that's more familiar with kind of emotional or care robots, or if people just think about agency and experience differently in different cultures, then certainly that would affect their willingness to adopt robots to do certain human tasks. I should know, what are the agency experience effects in, say, surveys in East Asia or Latin America, but I don't recall that offhand.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Adam, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Niels. Thanks a lot for this talk. It was really, really interesting. I'm still thinking about the whistleblower study, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it, because I guess you also know this research that people are generally averse to machines and robots making moral decisions. And from my conception, it was sort of like whistleblowing would be a moral task. So I was actually expecting that people would be more reluctant to having robot whistleblowers.
Yeah, you're exactly right. So like Bigman and Gray and Cognition have this paper showing, I think their paper basically shows people don't like robots making deontological, utilitarian, those types of decisions, those trade-offs, etc. And so that's good for me because it says, oh, there's actually some novelty. I thought people would find this work somewhat dull, but it also speaks to just heterogeneity of different moral decisions that can be made. And when there's a moral decision to be made that involves fairness, which I can tell you more about the scenarios I use, people believe the robot has more moral objectivity and less self-interest. So it might be the scenarios that I'm choosing. So in my studies, and now I've replicated this general finding several times, including with people with who are managers responsible for subordinates, we'll tell them, imagine this happened to you in your organization, where I even use the General Motors example, where there's a faulty ignition switch and the system designed to test the ignition switch reports to you that there's an error in the ignition switch. Do you think that system is capable of having an ulterior motive, subjectivity, self-interest, blah, blah, blah? Or Ryan uses the system to test for an error in the ignition switch. Ryan gets word there's a problem. Ryan chooses to report to his superior. And by the way, in both scenarios, nobody else reports. Okay, so that's another feature. You have one reporter, the system or the human, and no one else reports. So it's very easy to see that, when one human reports and others don't, that can look like a betrayal. When a robot reports and other people don't, like, how could a robot betray anything? And so I think I do obviously still believe that people don't like machines making life or death decisions. That's actually, in fact, somewhat what we found in our aversion to playing God study. They don't like machines that dictate life and death. But where there's a situation where a human could do something out of their self-interest, like maybe I accuse my colleague of plagiarism, or I see my colleague screw up and report it to the dean, someone could say, well, that guy is out for himself. You would never see that in a software program, which, I've used these programs now that can actually detect plagiarism. And so I think a lot of it has to do with the specific scenarios. And what your question does is it makes me say, okay, I need to be clear that these are boundary conditions, right? So in the case where someone could have acted self-interestedly, people like the robot.
Gotcha.
But maybe, you know, if there's no opportunity for self-interest or an ulterior motive, maybe then it's a little bit more complex. That's a great question.
Thank you.
Thanks. Sure.
I guess just to kind of follow up on that, I wonder if there's a situation where you're more likely to ascribe like selfless motive to the human and not ascribe those to the robot. So in your conditions, kind of asymmetric, or in the example you gave so far, it's asymmetric in that, you know, the robot can't have bad motives,
Yeah,
but a human might, but it can go in the other direction, right?
Yeah, so that's great. So as I mentioned, this is like I use several scenarios, but the General Motors one is real. That decision to not listen to the whistleblower ended up resulting in 132 people dying. Now that guy is seen as a selfless hero. He tried to bring the truth to light. Now, if the robot had reported that, we wouldn't say the robot is selfless. We would just say the robot is a robot. And so it works on both ends. Whistleblowers are rejected because they are seen as having the capacity for human whistleblowers, I should say, are seen as having the capacity for being selfish. But also, if they were right all along, they had the capacity for being seen as selfless. And so, you know, this guy who blew the whistle on Trump's phone call with Ukraine or whatever, like a lot of liberals in the US, you know, that guy's a hero. If this was some like automatic reporting system that detects notes of fraud, of bribery on a phone call, we wouldn't, you know, there wouldn't be, you can't praise a robot. So I love, you know, looking at the opposite end of that as well. Or it's like, you know, a philanthropist who just, you know, we have algorithms pick our stocks. If a philanthropist sets up an algorithm to like maximize their donations, I bet the philanthropist isn't seen as some great champion of universal well-being or something like that. So a lot to follow up on there.
So do we have any other questions from the floor? Let me close then by just thanking you again, Adam, for like a really fascinating and very diverse set of projects.
Yeah.
You're always finding creative ways of asking these interesting questions.
Well, thank you guys so much. This was, you know, really fun for me. During the pandemic with 2 kids, I don't have much fun at home. So this is the most fun I've had in a while. So hopefully I'll talk to you guys soon. And feel free to be in touch.
And let's follow up a conversation afterwards as well.
Excellent. All right. Take
Wonderful.
care.
Thank you so much, Adam. Great to have you.